All right, we are here this morning for the City Council Planning Committee. We have one item. I'm joined today with Councilmember Michael Lilliquist. I'm April Barker. And we have a presentation on insights and innovations to address homelessness and affordable housing. We've invited some Western students here that have been working on innovative ways to look at homelessness within the city and solutions. So I'll pass it to Adrienne. You can introduce yourself, and then we'll pass it on to the students.
Awesome. Good morning. I'm Adrienne Sullenberger. I'm the landlord liaison for Opportunity Council in Whatcom County. And I've been working a lot with Western's Health and Human Service Department to provide some support around the education and awareness of homelessness and affordable housing here in Bellingham and Whatcom County. And I think, Lily, you're ready to introduce the students. They've been working on a project to kind of do some additional research on what innovations can be used here locally, and they would like to share them with you.
And then, so if you want to speak from up there, or you can speak from right where you're at if you just push that mic. There you go. Do you have the red button on? There you go.
Hi, I'm Lily. I'm a sophomore in the Human Services program, and for our Human Services 303 class, which is Interpersonal Relations and Systems, we were partnered with Adrienne to research policies on affordable housing in Bellingham and how to possibly improve them. Our whole class kind of centered around the homelessness crisis in Bellingham and what we can do to address it. So thank you for being here.
Okay.
All right. So I'm Anna Shreve. I am also a student from the 303 class in Human Services. And our agenda today is a proposal of the Homeless Bill of Rights and what that is, why it's needed, and how it's worked in the past. Then we'll move into a presentation on shared housing and describe why that's beneficial for our community. And we will have a discussion of funding related to shared housing, following that, including levies and other incentives. And we'll give you some examples of how and where shared housing has worked in the past. So we're going to start off with the Homeless Bill of Rights and our proposal of that within Whatcom County. This was presented first and created by the National Coalition of Homelessness, and they described that the research and advocacy surrounding criminalization shows an increase of violence on homeless people and proving that added protection is needed to preserve their civil rights within our community and other communities. Housing is a basic human right, and criminalizing homelessness does not solve the problem. And it's kind of begging the question, how are homeless people supposed to pay tickets and fines when they are criminalized if they lack housing and an income? The Homeless Bill of Rights entails the fact that homeless people deserve protection against segregation and laws targeting homeless people for lack of housing and not their behavior and restrictions of use of public space. And it grants a right to privacy and property protection. It allows the opportunity to vote and feel safe within their communities. And it provides a broad access to shelter, social services, legal counsel, and quality education for the children of homeless families. And it also entails decriminalization of homelessness, because that's kind of what it's fighting against. So it has been enacted in Baltimore, Maryland, Connecticut, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, Puerto Rico, Rhode Island, and Traverse City, Michigan. And these are all places where it's currently being used. And it is under consideration and in the process of being approved in California, Colorado, Delaware, Duluth, Minnesota, Hawaii, where it goes under the title Housing is Healthcare, Knoxville, Tennessee, Massachusetts, Michigan, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Washington, D.C. And I think it would be really beneficial for Whatcom County to be the first county within Washington to take this to the next step, because as you can see up here, it doesn't have to be statewide approved, it can just be city or county approved. and this could set a trend for Washington in general. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Chloe Rosenfield, and I'm just going to explain a little bit about what shared housing is. So the definition of shared housing is having 2 or more people living in the same residence together and sharing the housing costs. So this would be sharing the rent, utilities, and just kind of everything that goes into a housing. And then some populations of shared housing can be single adults, veterans, single parents, families, youth, live-in care assistants, and the elderly. And then some characteristics are homelessness, mental health, and physical health. And then I just put in an example of what, this one is just an ad for shared housing. So this one was someone who was going to share a house with someone else and just provide some help around the house with chores, meal prepping. So this is just one example of what it could look like for shared housing. And then here are some examples of a reference checklist with questions, so kind of just showing what it could look like when they're going to find someone to share a house, and then the housing agreement, so also just kind of just the formal paperwork of the shared housing.
Hi, I'm Liz Kelly, and I'm going to be talking about why shared housing is important. So, shared housing is very important in Bellingham. Currently, as a community, we are in a crisis due to price inflation and lack of space. In Bellingham, 76% of the homeless population are single adults with no family and no place to go. Shared housing will reduce the number on the streets while also providing affordable shelter for those in need. Besides just benefits for the tenants, there's also incentives put in place for the landlords, so it will be like equally beneficial for both parties in place.
Hi, I'm Dakota Hayes. I'm going to be talking about some examples of shared housing. So one example of shared housing is the home share in Vermont, and it's a simple idea where 2 or more people share a home to their mutual benefit. Some like the idea of having another person around the house to offer companionship and security. Others are looking for another way to supplement their income. Where people can look for potential housemates would be through various methods such as buying an ad in the local paper, posting flyers, or online forums like Craigslist or Front Porch Forum. Another example is in Grand Rapids Catholic School is a former Catholic school built in 1922, turned into an affordable housing development. John Weinbeek, the executive director of Genesis Nonprofit Housing Corporation, noticed a for sale sign in the window when he was walking by, and then envisioned the opportunity for supportive and affordable housing within the school. Grand Rapids Mayor Rosalind Bliss is behind the project, saying that it fills a growing need in our community for high quality and long-term affordable housing.
Hi again, I'm Lily Donahoe, and I'm going to be talking about the incentives, levies, and funding surrounding homelessness and affordable housing. So briefly, we did a lot of research on what is currently in place in Bellingham, and we researched the Bellingham Home Fund and the Bellingham Resolution number 2018-09. So the Home Fund, as we know, was renewed in 2018, and that is more focused on low-income family units rather than individuals, but it is a very helpful proposition that allows for the building and refurbishing of affordable housing units. And the Resolution 2018-09, which was just passed in June of 2018, basically provides a property tax levy and raises $4 million a year in $40 million in aggregate funds over 10 years to assist those in homelessness or in need of lower income housing and people that just can't afford the rent in Bellingham. Also, in the city of Bellingham, currently only 3 unrelated individuals are able to live together, which we know is not very enforced, but we're afraid that if someone is trying to find affordable housing as a homeless individual or as a very low-income person, that law will still be used against them despite it not really being used against students. So therefore, we're proposing some additional incentives, funding, and levies. So in terms of landlord incentives, as Liz was discussing, we found a few good examples that are being practiced in other areas. So the landlord accreditation scheme is being practiced in the United Kingdom, and it's a comprehensive incentive program for landlords, meaning that they provide various incentives such as financial and free training programs for any landlord that is able to support low-income individuals within their units. So some examples of financial incentives would be subsidized or free safety inspections and equipment, fee reduction on maintenance, property improvement loans, housing vouchers, and free advertising in the paper. And some training program incentives that have been used across the United States are one in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that's called How to Be a Proactive Property Manager. And that's a free training program just to improve landlord accountability and things like that. And in Mesa, Arizona, there's a crime-free rental housing program. And that is basically a training on how to make a landlord's community safer. And in terms of funding, we would like to partner with the Home Fund and promote more units intended for individuals rather than just families, because although families are very important, we do have a much higher rate of individuals in homelessness than any other population. We would also like to take a portion of the $4 million provided annually and push that towards building affordable and shared housing units. And we would also like to take 10% of new apartment units within a complex and set that aside for shared and affordable housing. So that would mean if a new complex was being built, the landlord would be responsible for 10% of those units being at a lower income or lower rent rate. In terms of levies, we would like to change the law in Bellingham from 3 to 6 individuals that are legally allowed to live together. We would also like to implement this policy in terms of landlord incentives and funding and make that more of an established policy in law. And we would also like to touch on mixed income for shared housing, which would mean that low, middle, and higher income families or individuals would live together, which would subsidize the cost and make it a more sustainable environment. So like Chloe touched on earlier, if someone from a middle income was sharing housing or a unit within their home with a lower income individual, that would help subsidize the rent for both parties. Thank you.
All right, and to review what we have proposed, we are proposing the decriminalization of homelessness, which entails the Homeless Bill of Rights, which was presented by the National Coalition of Homelessness. Do you guys want me to do the rest? Okay. And we are also proposing that the City of Bellingham implement shared housing practices by changing the policy from 3 to 6 unrelated people permitted to cohabitate. We are proposing that by promoting renting out of individual rooms in homes, it will be more beneficial to the homeless population, and by building more affordable housing units that accommodate for shared housing practices. And we're proposing that the City of Bellingham improve affordable housing practices by initiating the 10% affordable unit policy on all new apartment complexes, and by providing landlord incentives for those promoting affordable housing and shared housing and mixed income housing to subsidize the rent for all populations, whether they be low income, middle income, or high income. And these are our references. Thank you for having us.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure to come to your class and speak with you all and learn what you all are really bringing into Bellingham with your shared experience, but also what you're thinking about in terms of making this a more inclusive place to live. So thank you. I have a question for landlord incentives. Did you get very far on thinking about what that looks like for a city and policy? Like ways to incentivize landlords? Because if you look at our units per bedroom, we have plenty of bedrooms for people in Bellingham, but when you look at our units for housing, we do not. So what types of incentives did you come across for shared housing?
Things that are already established or things that we would like to put in place.
Things that you might have been inspired by that you saw?
Oh, so I was mainly inspired by I mean, not just me, but in my research, I was mainly looking at places that are outside of Washington State. I didn't find anything in Washington State easily that provided good examples of incentives. But basically the idea that actually Adrian helped us a lot with this portion of it, and it seemed like a great idea to say, if you are willing to subsidize some of your rent in these units, we will provide you these incentives like maintenance fees, reduction, and things like that. And that's just proven effective in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The article that I read about that was saying that providing those free training programs was a great incentive to not only community build, but also lower the rates and make landlords more kind of liable for the actions that they were doing.
Excellent. And we're joined here with Councilmember Borneman. Councilmember Lillquist?
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I think you've covered a lot of the right areas that I've been looking at myself. I do have a couple of questions. You talked about homeless bill of rights. Did you look into recent federal court rulings on that issue?
I have not seen federal court rulings surrounding that, but I know that it is like working very well in several different places right now. I don't know about the.
Yeah, so I think you should maybe look into that. There's a recent federal court rulings, and actually rulings go back to the 1980s, which basically say the U.S. Constitution does protect against criminalizing homelessness. If a law is passed which effectively criminalizes the state of not having a house, that's been thrown out by the courts. There was a recent ruling in, I think, the District Court for Seattle that said if you're living in your car, the car has to be treated as a homestead and certain home protections apply. So I would think that a homeless bill of rights could be written to rest very firmly on established law. So I don't think of it so much as inventing a new set of rights. I think those rights already exist, but it might be very good to indicate exactly why those rights exist and found those in existing law. So I think it's a really strong idea that could be moved forward.
Yeah, when I was researching this, I found that in Marysville, Washington, it is currently criminalized. You can be arrested for living on the streets and taken to jail. And that's kind of what inspired this, because it was just so close to home that like there are people still being arrested for simply just like living on the streets. And I thought that it's really necessary because I know that violence against homeless people is also really prevalent and they can't always access the resources that they need and get legal accommodations when fighting this. So that's kind of where that
Yeah,
was
so
inspired.
my point of view would be the Marysville law is probably unconstitutional, but
Yeah.
I don't know for sure. I also want to ask about, or comment on the issue of three unrelated. Three unrelated rule only applies, I believe, in single-family zones. So in multifamily zones, you can have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's the whole point behind a multifamily zone. So did you look at the issue of single-family versus multifamily and kind of how much yield you'd get, or how much, how beneficial it would be to relax that requirement, seeing as how it applies to single-family areas?
So that was something that we kind of touched briefly on and definitely needs more research behind, but we just knew that that was a policy. In terms of mixed or multifamily and single family, we were more focusing on that as an issue in terms of shared housing. If it was technically a single family unit and then you were bringing in other individuals to live with you, when that would be an issue. So it was more focused on shared housing, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Right, and there's also,
Michael.
go ahead.
Thank you. So I think around that, what I heard you all saying was that it's not being enforced with students and that you didn't want to see that being enforced with adults or others that are trying to share housing with homelessness. And so I think although, they of course didn't get down into the weeds about, how many multifamily, but we have run into this, and Adrian, you might be able to speak, trying to do we do have some shared housing programs, trying to work with seniors and others, and really running into a problem where you might have a 4-bedroom home, and you don't want to break the law, but it's also about subsidies, and these are government dollars and some of the hiccups there.
Right, yeah. So from a local perspective and one that works with landlords frequently, I'm offered very often single-family homes that are 4 or 5 bedrooms. And it would be an amazing opportunity to utilize those to house our displaced seniors or our single homeless population. And again, they're pointing out that with the ordinance in place, those landlords are apprehensive to kind of move forward with that in the event that they would be penalized, for breaking ordinance. I do want to go back for a second to the decriminalization of homelessness also, because though we don't directly have the Homeless Bill of Rights here, we do have a lot of ticketing behavior. And I know this working with the homeless population for about 17 years, that we're doing a lot of sitting in line tickets, public urination tickets. So when folks don't have a home or have access to facilities, they are definitely criminalized, right, for the lack thereof. And that those fines and those fees add up. So when I go to help them get housed and they're owing $3,000 in tickets and fines or have multiple trespassing or public urination, like that doesn't make the process, I guess, easier for them. And so if we could really, as a community and as a city, take a look at how we're interacting with that population and how we are penalizing them for something that they don't, really have a lot of control over, it'd be beneficial.
Michael?
That's an excellent point about public urination, for example. If we don't provide public restrooms, 24-hour
Right.
public restrooms, what are you going to do? And so that is why I have been supporting and talking about public
Yeah.
restrooms for quite a while. We do now have a 24-hour, at least one available in Maritime Heritage Park, especially built
Right.
to be able to be open 24 hours. But, I mean, one in the downtown area.
Right, yeah, I'd agree. And we do think, the efforts that have been put forward to create facilities, we were aware.
All right, well, I don't know if you have anything to add, anything from the mayor's office? Okay, Michael?
I have a question, really more for staff. So there is a Washington State definition of what a family is that we adopt, and it's really very broad. Grandmothers, cousins, uncles, it's very broad, but I don't think it includes things like special caregivers or some of the other shared housing suggestions that were up here. Rather than relaxing the Rule 3, or is another way, can we broaden the definition of family or quasi-family to make shared housing possible if you're a qualified disabled senior, or if you're a home health care worker, or, broaden it in that way to allow more house sharing by addressing the definition?
Well, to some extent, we already do. We have special provisions consistent with state law to deal with group homes and group homes for seniors. Right now, the Planning Commission is considering allowing for shared housing with appropriate supervision for those who are unsheltered. These are smaller shelters that are to be established in the community. Those are in single-family homes and be allowed throughout all of the single-family residential districts that are moving forward. So these are things we're currently working on to allow them in the single-family areas. As you noted, they are allowed by right to have shared housing in multifamily.
And Mr. Sepler, aren't your staff already looking at adjusting or relaxing the Rule of 3?
Well, to appreciate the notion that we don't enforce against students, we do follow up on complaints when they come in, but it is a very difficult rule to address. It's hard to know who's resident and who's not, and it's very easy to evade. However, we do follow up on all our complaints. In terms of the Rule of 3, we need to assess whether it's still reflective of the demographics in our community and in the United States, and that's a discussion we should have in the near future. It's on our work program.
Excellent. I think we'll let you all go. Thank you so much for coming to City Hall and interacting with your government, and I hope that you'll continue the work that you're doing, and you may want to follow up with us regarding Homeless Bill of Rights and other things. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
End of committee.
Can I have one more question for staff, though?
Sure.
It has to do with the students were recommending certain incentives, and one of the incentives that was talked about over a year or two ago had to do with a mitigation bank or an abatement program for landlords who would take in tenants who have no recent record of renting. It was Kate, I think Bartholomew worked on that as part of the Community Solutions Work Group. Do you know if that's going anywhere? The idea is if you're homeless, you have no good track record for renting, and an abatement program would basically backstop it. The landlord wouldn't be at risk if the person skipped out or left damages and didn't have a deposit. Mr. Sepler, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. I think it was specific to the damages to try to provide the assurance that those would be covered, because folks are concerned about taking that first step to bring someone in whose track record may not be perfect. And this was a way of providing almost an underwriting function, as I recall. And we've looked into that, and I'll check on current status and get back to you if we've been able to advance it. It's a great idea, in a sense, because that's all that stood in the way for some folks being housed.
Right, that's the one thing you don't have is a track record, and that's why the landlord is worried. Let's address the worry.
Right, makes sense.
I think, and just because, oh, sorry, you can go ahead. Adrian, just so we can follow up on that, there are opportunities for landlords who might not want to take that risk that can have Opportunity Council do a lease option so that the Opportunity Council itself is responsible for that unit. Is that correct? And so maybe just to clarify, there may be people out there that want to put their house toward, or one of their renters.
First of all, we
towards
can
this.
all, folks that work with any form of subsidized housing program, so it could be Section 8, it could be subsidy coming directly through the Opportunity Council or another partner agency to the state's mitigation funds for landlords. And those help provide protections, against damages, or even making a unit ready to pass an inspection requirement so that an individual can move in. And vacancy loss is also compensated for during that wait period of time where you maybe have a tenant approved but need to wait for a city and/or housing authority inspection to pass through. But you are also right that there is presently a master lease rental program that the Opportunity Council sponsors, so we are the landlord and then the tenant rents from us. However, accessing that program specifically has stringent requirements of chronic homelessness and a form of disability attached to it. So it's not an affordable option for just the population at large, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And that'll be end of committee.